Hi everyone, this is James from the Freemasons and welcome to this second tutorial covering analog style processing in DAWs. Today we're in Ableton Live and we're going to be showing you how you can use some of just the internal plugins to generate some of that warmth and richness that's always associated with analog processing and analog mixing. If you haven't seen the first tutorial, even though it's logic based, do have a look because it covers at the beginning some of the details as to what analog equipment does to bring the warmth forward and why we use certain techniques here. So as I say, we're going to use just the internal plugins here, and then later on we'll look at some of the commercially available plugins that can really help you bring forward an analog sound. The track we're working on is something that we're currently doing with Joel Edwards, and it's very retro and perfect for this style of processing. Okay, so it's a very retro vibe. It's obviously got a lot of 80s influence there. So all of that stuff was mixed on mixed on analog desks, recorded on tape machines, and a lot of it was processed through some very high-end analog equipment, probably some valve microphones, all that kind of thing. So that's the kind of stuff we're looking for. Now, as I mentioned in the previous tutorial, there are three kind of main effects that analog signal processing will have on your material, and all of them are effectively forms of distortion. So what will normally tend to happen is that you will find that there will be some saturation, whether it just be in the top end or the low end or across the board. So I'm going to use Ableton's own saturator here. There'll also be some compression as an artifact of the saturation and from some of the other equipment. So we're going to use the glue compressor. And there'll also be some changes in the frequency response, and all analog equipment will kind of carve off some frequencies on the bottom and carve some frequencies off the top. So we're going to kind of emulate that, and then I'll show you some EQ tricks, effectively EQing into these roll-offs that can really help you create bite and power, but without the kind of normal harshness that you would hear in analog systems. So without further ado, let's just have a look at the drum track. Now you will notice I've got the Waves NLS channel on here. Don't worry about that, I'll show you why we've got that in a minute, because that's set up across the entire page. But just for now, just concentrate on these three. So first of all, I'm going to have a look at the saturator. Just play our drum track through in its bare form. Okay, it's nice, but it needs some weight, and as all digitally created drum tracks are, it tends to be incredibly transient. Now, tape machines will kind of round all of these off, especially as they're used heavily on a session and the tape goes over it many, many times. It does tend to kind of wear it down. So a bit of saturation, some compression will now help us emulate a bit of that. So I'm just going to not really touch many more of the default settings on the saturator, and just bring it up just by a couple of dB. And by turning it on and off there, you can already have you can already hear there's a degree of weight being added. Now, don't go too mad. Obviously, you don't want to really impart too much actual distortion. And also, very handily on the saturator, there is a dry and wet control. So just bring it down to about 75% or so, or 70%. That just allows some of the original material just to come through nicely. And you can already hear the bottom end starting to thicken up. Now the next one I'm going to attack is the new addition in Live 9, the excellent glue compressor from these guys, Cytomic. I would say if you've not checked out their filter, the Drop, do. It's utterly incredible. It's one of the best software filters available. But it's based on an SSL desk compressor, which is obviously the famous console that was used all the way from the 80s through to the 90s. And there are a couple of tricks, and this is the first one I'm going to show you with drums. So set your ratio to 2. Put the attack to 10, and then bring the release down fairly sharpish. I'm going to turn the soft clip on and start to bring the threshold down and really quite dig into it a little. Having a ratio of 2 there was a favourite desk setting from a lot of engineers. It just really did help to do the magic glue that the SSL compressors are well known for. The reason I've got the soft clip on is that we're going to push out of this compressor into the soft clip a little bit, and we're going to use one very, very useful control on this, and this is the range control. Now, the great thing about Ableton, obviously, in this box over here on the left, it'll show you what any of the controls do if you hover over it, but just look what happens graphically if I bring this range control in. We're looking at the VU meter here, or the gain reduction meter, and you can see that it's going to create a limit to how far the compressor can actually work, and that's very handy for doing some quite heavy-handed moves like this, and then just bringing it under control but still retaining that bite. And already you're seeing the soft clip there starting to kick in. Very, very useful on drums. As I say, what we're trying to do is round some of these transients off. And now I'm just going to bring the mix back a little bit so that we're, again, having some of the original uncompressed signal just come through. And that really helps just bring some of the transient information back into focus. And with me bypassing it there, you can really hear that it's starting to glue exactly what it's designed to do. Okay, so I've just bunched up our saturator and glue compressor into a little group there, so we can turn both of those processes on and off at once to hear how it's affecting the signal. And now let's look at our EQ. I've just used the standard EQ8 from Ableton Live, but you'll notice that I've already got some roll-off set up. This one I'm going to keep to about 15 or 16K. And the bottom one I'm just going to bring up to somewhere between 35 to 40. Now, the reason I do all of this is that if we're emulating analog, analog tape will start to roll off naturally, as will analog microphones and analog preamps. They will roll off a little bit at the bottom and roll off a little bit at the top. And that allows us to do some very clever things with EQ. I can just use a very simple shelf here, and you can see what I'm doing as I push that shelf up. It adds, but you've still got this smoothness at the top. Now, if I take the filter off, look what happens just from a graphical representation of the frequency response. It just goes up there, and this kind of stuff within digital systems is the enemy if you're after an analog sound, because that's where it all gets far too brittle, far too nasty. And even though we may not be able to hear those frequencies, they do interact with the other ones and create that traditionally brittle and nasty analog sound. So let me just quickly reset this, and we'll go from straight. So we're listening to the drum track, and listen what happens as I dramatically bring, I'll do some roll off here, and then we'll kind of set a point and then EQ that shelf into it. And as you can see, that's far less brittle than a kind of standard shelf EQ may be with the filter taken off. And it's really starting to impart some of that warmth that you might find from a desk EQ or a high-end analog system. We're going to do quickly the same now with the bass, and I'm going to use a shelf, something that a lot of people might say, we don't want to really use a shelf on the bass end, you need it more controlled. But for a drum track like this, where there's not a huge amount of sub floating around, the kick drums are fairly short, it will work. So you can hear what the interaction between that filter there and this actual shelf EQ is doing. And as I said before in the previous tutorial, the relationship between the bands and these low pass and high pass filters are one of the most important things you can kind of get your head around in EQ, because our ears do roll off naturally, and especially down on the bottom end here, there is so much sub floating around in digital systems, especially seeing the instruments like the virtual synths are just creating almost theoretical frequencies that don't exist in hardware equipment. It's very important to get your head around these roll-offs and to try and work out how they interact. So look, let me just I'm going to group everything together there, and we can do an entire before and after of our drum processing. As you can hear, so much brighter, so much more powerful. I'm just going to drop the level a little bit so it syncs in with the track, and let's play it back with the track.
You drive me crazy, just watch all alone. In all the world and all the places, you're the one I want to go. You drive me crazy.
Wonderful. So you can already hear the weight and the power that that's starting to add to everything. Now, okay, the next thing, well, as soon as we've done the drums, I'm just going to turn the vocals off and that synth. Let's have a quick look at the bass. I'm going to start to move into the area of commercial plugins now as well, so you can see some of the bits and pieces. The first one I want to show you is one of the cheapest that we've come across for this kind of thing. It's incredibly simple. It's made by Fielding DSP, and it's called the Reviver, and it's available now not just as a Mac plugin but as a Windows one too. I think it's $29. Now it has two main process sliders and just input and basic output. And what these do is bring in extra information, harmonic information, that's not there in the original. The first slider brings in second harmonics, and this one obviously brings in third harmonics. Now, it's this third harmonic slider that is where the action is. And third harmonics are generated by the kind of analog equipment that we associate with warmth. For example, tubes, tape machines, transformers, that kind of thing. And I've yet to hear a drum, a bass or a drum track or a bus that would actually not benefit from this. This just seems to add something special. Let me show you on this bass what I mean. Now, obviously, there's some level difference there as it's going in. That's going to be because we're adding information, so that's there's always going to be a slight change, but you can kind of balance it out here and just hear the weight. Just seems to add a wonderful thickness to the bottom end. We'll even do that on our drum track quickly as well. All right, let's stick it right at the end here. Now, once again, our bass sounds like it could do with a similar kind of process to what we had before. So I'm actually, just for the sake of simplicity, I'm literally going to copy that big rack that we had on the drums and stick it on our bass channel and see what happens. Okay, maybe a bit too much in the bass gain there. Wonderful. So yet again, the same style of processing, maybe with some frequency moves. I mean, I would probably go a bit more to town on it, but you can already hear what it's actually starting to do there. Okay, guys, I think now we'll start to go into the world of the commercial plugins. And the first one I want to show you is fairly famous in an awful lot of heavy music, heavy electronic music circles, and that's Isotope's Trash. And now this is an incredibly complex plugin that will that has available to it a whole series of processes to mangle and distort and completely mess up your material, and also make it just cut through and sound enormous. But I want to show you one that we found that seems to really just add a bit of the kind of the distortion characteristics that are seen in analog equipment. Very simple. I've only got the first Trash module on here. I'm going to select triangle, and you can see that it looks like it's pretty much going to mangle the audio. Let me just show you what this is like in bypass. So we're on the polysynth part here. Yeah, that's pretty hardcore, as you can hear. So look, I'm just going to, with this first control here, I'm going to bring it down so the amount of warping going on is fairly reduced, and then you can drive it into the effect using this pre-control. Once again, a wet control is available, so you can use it as a kind of parallel process and have some of the original come through. So once again, you can see with the bypass, turning it on and off, you can see what it's doing. It's bringing some compression artifacts right across the material. So some of the top end's starting to cut through a little bit more, and it's just getting bigger, thicker, and rounder. Let me show you this in situ now. This also has some fantastic presets, and one of our favourites at the moment, there's a classic textures expansion for this, and there is a brilliant preset called 80s Retro Synth, which does exactly what it says on the package. Now, often with these plugins, you'll find that some of the presets, when you hear the sound in isolation, just don't work. But because they're all starting to do a degree of compression, saturation, and things like that, it's definitely worth hearing them in the track whilst you make your decisions. There's another one that I do want to show you that's quite famous within mixing and rock circles almost, but it's great on synths. And that's from the American company Sound Toys. That's their now quite famous Decapitator. What this will do is emulate the distortion characteristics of various high-end outboard. I know the N stands for Neve and T stands for Thermionic Culture, and I believe A stands for API, their preamps. And it just allows you to it's captured the degree of distortion that comes out of each unit and allow you to drive into it with some fairly harsh settings as well. But once again, great mix control on the right here that allows you to bring some of it in. So let me just bypass it quickly, and you'll hear the part roar again. Okay, if I place it in, I'm going to use the Neve setting and really drive into it quite a lot. Prefer the API setting there. Okay, let's bring the mix back a little bit. And the Decapitator, I should say, is fairly self-explanatory. It does exactly really what it's suggesting. It's just going to come up, limit and distort your audio, but in a way that tends to sit nicely in a track. And luckily they've handed out these filters either side, which allow you just to tame it, because obviously as you're driving into any kind of distortion, more frequencies get created than when they were originally. So these are really handy just to tame it down. And in analog processing, this bit from 20k down to maybe, I'm not quite sure where we are here, but anything between 20 and about 15 is where you want to make sure that you are keeping everything nicely rolled off, because everything can get very digital very quickly if you're not. So you can hear the tonal changes that it's making there. And once again, let me just play you that back in the track. Great, it's really starting to cut through a little bit more than it was before, as it did with the trash module there. And this is half the battle within modern music production, because everything now is getting so loud. And if you look back to, if you reference even 90s records or even records at the beginning of 2000, the size of our drums in music production now is enormous. So getting everything else to cut through really takes some clever work. Okay, so the next thing I want to look at is the plugins that have come about just recently that emulate the behavior of analog mixing desks. Here we're going to be looking at the Waves NLS, the nonlinear summing system. There is another one made by Slate Digital called the Virtual Console Collection. Now, there was some confusion when they first came out because people were putting the channel strips just on one track and then wondering why they couldn't really hear any difference. And all of this is very subtle, but it is a cumulative effect. So we've got this set up the way it should be. So every single channel has its own NLS channel applied to it. But as you can see here, I've selected a VCA group for every single one, which is kind of emulating the way the SSL desk worked, but it just allows us to control every single version of the plugin using just one actual interface. So here I've got the stereo bus set up on the master channel, and using the VCA tab here, I can actually change the model desk on every single channel and the master bus here just through this one control. There's 3 desk models, and the most famous one is the one we're going to be using first, which is Spike Stent's SSL console. Now, Spike Stent's one of the most famous mixers in the world. He comes from the UK. His credit list is absolutely phenomenal, as is his style of mixing. But there was something very special about his SSL by all accounts, so it was very good that Waves managed to actually model this. I'm going to keep it on bypass first, and I'm going to take it in and out. Now, this will take in and out all of the versions of NLS across all of the tracks, as well as the master busing. I'm also going to slightly tweak the drive here on a group basis, so that's going to increase the drive, in other words, the processing amount on all of the channels and the bus individually, so you can kind of hear it a bit better. Now, if you're on laptop speakers, you're not going to hear very much here. Please plug some headphones in. This is an HD video, and as I say, this is very subtle. I'm also going to switch between the different desk types so you can kind of hear the effect working. Okay, here we go. So as you can hear there, it really does make a difference when it's across every single track. But as I say, it is very, very subtle. But once you have this set up and you're actually putting a mix into it, you'll find that the results will be much more apparent, and you'll just find everything kind of glues together a little bit better. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is a little trick we found out using, in particular, the new Pultec plugin from the UAD system. Now, it's absolutely brilliant. It's a very simple EQ. I'm sure a lot of you have seen these kind of things. You just have some very basic tone controls. Just you have a frequency selector. You can boost and attenuate the frequency at the same time, the selected frequency at the same time. And then you can apply some broad or sharp EQ at certain frequencies, and then attenuate just to roll the top off, as we saw using way back just the EQ8 earlier on. Now I'm going to turn everything down. I'm not going to have any processing at all, and I'm going to show you a little trick. They have modeled the transformers on this plugin absolutely brilliantly, so you get a little bump even with it just in circuit, but it's very subtle. And what we found, if you just hit duplicate, and I'm going to put in 4 Pultecs here straight in a row, no EQ on all of them, group them all together so I can turn them all on and off at once. And what we're effectively doing is hearing the processing of 4 transformer emulations. So let me just play back. It does make quite a startling difference. And we're getting a bit of distortion there from the NLS. Let's just bring that gain down. Play through again. Now, as I say, there is absolutely no EQ processing going on there. That is just having the unit in line, and the original Pultecs used to do that. So it's great to see that this can be replicated in software a little bit. I'm just going to take maybe a couple out, and I'm going to show you one other thing. Again, we're on the UAD, but we're using their 1176 copy, a very famous compressor from the 70s era. And it had a crazy mode. I've got shift down held down on the keyboard, and these are the ratio selection buttons that are normally just 1. So you either have a ratio of 4, 8, 12 or 20. If I hold shift down, I can turn a number of them on, which you used to be able to do with the original unit. And when you had them all in, it was known as Brit mode, and it really slammed drum tracks together. I'm going to do the reverse. Holding shift down, I'm going to take all of the ratio buttons off. I'm going to do it. I'm doing that to do something quite special. I'm going to bring the output right down. And now what I'm going to do, bearing in mind we're on our master bus, I'm going to drive the input of this 1176 really hard. Get it, and it's going to get really grungy and quite nasty, but in a pleasant analog way. Okay, that'll be enough. I'm just going to bring our level back up so we can hear. And you can hear it crunch, not exactly what you'd want as a process by itself, but let me just put this in parallel. If you've not seen my tutorial on parallel processing in Ableton, do have a look at that because it will make sense what I'm doing here. I've put it in a group. I'm just going to rename this 1176. We'll call it 1176 Grunge actually, because I'm going to use another one in a minute. I'm going to bring that down, and then I'm going to just click here on the blank bit and create chain. And what this will do is we'll create a completely dry chain with no processing going on, and then we've got the 1176 in. And look what happens when I feed some of that grungy 1176 back into a dry signal. There it is by itself, but it just adds a degree of all the stuff that we're looking for, those analog artifacts. Now I'm going to bung another one in, so we're creating another rack, and let's really go to town. Let me show you what this Brit mode's all about. So all the ratio buttons are now in, holding down shift, and I'm going to feed the track into it. Now it's worth playing with your attack and release settings here, but you can hear all sorts of fat distortion going on. But once again, look at what happens when I feed it back in. Particularly on some of the drum sounds, like the big reverb clap there, you're starting to hear that kind of big fat compression that we're all used to hearing from, mainly from radio compressors, I suppose, as we heard the stuff way back in the day. But we can go even further with this, so we're going to have now 3 UADs in parallel, and I'm just going to do one to really catch the drums. One thing I should say about an 1176, they designed it so that this is a slow attack and this is a fast attack. It kind of goes against convention for everything else, but it is true to the hardware. And once again, bring some of that in. Now it is starting to distort slightly, as you can hear, but with some careful balancing, I'm on headphones here, so I'm not going to be able to hear everything that's going on. You can really get some great effects with this, and obviously, once again with live, if you love what you've done, 1176 smashed, you can name it and save it in a preset in your library. So let me briefly recap what we've done here on the master bus. And sometimes with very retro stuff like this, where you want the kind of squishing going on, it's quite good to actually get all of that set up a little bit once you've done your basic mix or basic levels, and then actually start to mix into it. Because the way the compressors and the sort of analog style processing will work into it will really change the way that you level everything. One other thing I just want to show you. Once again, these are quite subtle, but there's been a whole series of tape emulations come out just recently. You know, we've seen quite a lot of UAD. I do want to show you a brand new one because it's come out ever so cheap from Yuhi. the makers of synths like Diva, Ace and Zebra. They've got a great tape emulation called Saturn. So here it is. You can already hear popping up the noise. We can control that. We're using the service thing here. We can turn some of the hiss down. But you also see some great controls here for allowing you to see the emulation of what's known as the head bump on a tape machine. Now, head bump is just caused by some of the characteristics of the process of going to tape using a magnetic head. And it is dependent, and you'll see it change if I change the speed up and down here. You'll see just down here, this curve will change slightly. It'll actually rise up as we increase the tape speed. So that's useful to know that there's going to be a peak in the bass response around that area. So let me just drop it kind of randomly in the middle, and we'll just balance this up. Now, I was taking it in and out there, and unless you're really listening carefully, you won't notice much difference. It does make a difference, I promise you, especially on the way the bass end sits in with the track and the way the top end does as well. And the great thing is with this button on, any changes you make to the input is being kind of controlled conversely on the output to make sure that the level you're monitoring is pretty much the same. So you are just hearing the effects. Let's switch the tape version to vintage now and just play a little bit of that. Okay, as I say, it is subtle, but once you hear it and you start playing with it, it's worth demoing this just to see what kind of difference it can make. It can make a particular difference on bass instruments as well, so let me just quickly put it across here. And hopefully you can hear a kind of thickness and warmth come into the bass there. So there's just one other plugin I want to show you before we finish off, and that's a kind of slight oddity within plugin circles. It's made by an Italian company called Acustica, and it's called Nebula. And as you can see, it's kind of designed to emulate some rack equipment, and for good reason. What this is a very advanced form of convolution, and I use the term lightly because I'm sure there's a lot more to it than that. But it's considered on an awful lot of forums to be as close to analog as you can get, and there's an awful lot of people on sites like Gearsluts that is heavily analog dominated, saying that this really is the kind of pinnacle of almost sampling the analog world. And what it allows people to do is to take snapshots of their analog equipment and then provide a series of fairly basic controls. And normally, like for example on this Neve 81 EQ, just one band within one unit. And it's incredible, to be honest. And the great thing also about it is the additions for it, which are from various other pieces of hardware, are created by third parties nice and cheaply. You can get a pack of compressors for $19, that kind of thing. So it's well worth looking into. Now, I've currently got it set up here on our drum bus. And as you can see, I've got quite a few. I've got some of them in parallel, using the audio effect rack here, as we've seen before, and some of them just in a serial nature. But let me turn off the whole chain and show you what it's capable of. That's before, and that's after. Let me just talk you through each one. What I've got up here, first of all, is a Neve 81, and it's the high mid band of a Neve 81, and it's quite vicious when you get into it. But provides that beautiful presence lift that only Neves really can. This next one, I've got one of the presets in here that actually comes with the library, the Digi Dual Tube compressor, and some fairly heavy-handed compression going on. Let me just show you what it's like, just the compressed version. So it's doing some fairly heavy work, and then I've just got it set up in parallel here against. without, and now with. Following that, I got some very tasty bass EQ from a third-party library I bought, I think for an incredibly cheap price, of an old mastering compressor, and the frequency set here to 56 hertz, so it's way down in the bass. If I really go to town on it, you'll hear what it does. Beautiful sounding EQs these, they really do kind of jump out, but it's not all Nebula does, it's not just EQs and compression. Let me give you an example here on the guitars. I've got one set up in parallel doing a very good emulation of a nice spring reverb. So let me just play the guitars dry. Now there's already a bit of spring on the sample already, but let me show you what I'm adding. And it really does shine at reverbs. There is a separate version of the plugin specifically for reverbs here called Nebula 3 Reverb, and it's just got a bit more processing headroom, I think, effectively in it. But as you can see here, I've got quite a collection set up. It's great at emulating certain preamps. You'll find some classics in here. Fairchilds in my Rhodes, Avalons, and even some, I think there's the V72s, yeah, the Telefunk and the V72s in there. Does a great job at all of those kind of emulations. And as I say, there's an ever-growing library on it, so it's well worth checking out because it makes this much of a difference to a drum track. Actually, one little brilliant setting I found here, someone's done a very bright version of Fairchild compression, which is in its solo form here. Now, that's not something you'd really want your audio to sound like by itself, but because Acoustica have coded this so well, it's perfectly usable in parallel. So that's without. And that's with some of that beautifully shiny compression, and that really does start to get you a nice radio sound. So do check it out. It's not as expensive as a lot of other things, but because it's just so versatile, it's very, very useful. Just watch your processor overhead, though, it will eat it. Okay, I hope that's helped. Any suggestions for further tutorials, please do let us know either on Facebook or Twitter or on the comments of the YouTube videos. We are slow sometimes, but we do try to look at all of them. Many thanks, and we'll see you again.